Hi. So in this video, we will be answering the AIM question, what is the difference between a primary and a secondary source? We will go over vocabulary and compare and contrast primary and secondary sources. The first vocabulary word for a day is source. This is information used when making an argument or telling a story. So another word for a source that you use when making an argument or telling a story is evidence. What's another word for a source you use when making an argument or telling a story? Now, there are two main types of sources that historians use. The first is called a primary source. A primary source is a source of information created during the time being studied. Primary means first. So since it was the first source written during the time being studied, it is called the primary source. What does primary mean? So the next type of source we are going to look at is a secondary source. If primary sources come first and they are created during the time period being studied, what do you think a secondary source is? See if you can write your own definition before I show you the official one. All right, listen, whatever you wrote, as long as you put thought into it, it's good, you'll get some credit for it. But the official definition for a secondary source is a source of information created after the time being studied. So a primary source comes first and is created during the time being studied. A secondary source comes second and is created after the time being studied. What is the difference between a primary and a secondary source? So now that we've defined them, we're going to compare and contrast them. So a primary source has certain advantages. Since the information is recorded in the moment, it lets us know how people living back then felt. And it can provide first-person accounts. So because people wrote it during the time we're studying, it lets us hear the voices of people who lived in the past. Primary sources also have some disadvantages. Sometimes they only tell one side of a story because only one person wrote their story down. Sometimes they were written before all the information is known. And sometimes they are hard to find or incomplete because they are so old. What is one advantage of primary sources and what is one disadvantage? Examples of primary sources include diaries, newspapers, photographs, and government. Let me move this little extra slide there. And government reports. So anything written, taken, or made during the time period you are studying. Which of these items is an example of a primary source? So secondary sources also have some advantages. They are easier to find and they can tell the whole story. So the primary source, since it was written at the time, it might have been written during the middle of a war or during the middle of a global pandemic. And because they were written in the middle of what was going on, they can tell us exactly what people thought and what people felt back then, but they can't tell the whole story because they're being written in the middle of the story. Secondary sources are written years and years and years later. So because they come long after the war or the pandemic or whatever is going on has ended, they can tell the whole story. They're also often easier to read. They're written in modern language, where a lot of primary sources are written using the language of the time. Think about the Declaration of Independence or the Pledge of Allegiance, for an example. They are very hard for us to understand, even though they're still written in English, because the English that was spoken when they were written is so different. Disadvantages of primary sources disadvantages of secondary sources include that they are often written after primary sources are lost. So where a primary source might not be able to tell the whole story because the story isn't finished, oftentimes secondary sources are written after some of the documents that would help tell the story are lost. So the secondary source cannot tell the whole story because of that. They can also reflect the time they were written. So if I was trying to learn about the 1700s and I was reading a book written in the 1950s, it could tell me about the 1700s, but it would also tell me a bit about how people thought and felt in the 1950s. And that could throw me off because I might not be able to tell if a thought or a feeling in the secondary source was from the time period I'm studying or the time period when the book was written. What is one advantage and one disadvantage of secondary sources? And examples of secondary sources include textbooks, ELA readings, and popular history books. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you for your time.